Ogres are like onions.
They stink?
Yes. No.
Oh, they make you cry?
No.
Oh, you leave them out in the sun, they get all brown, start sprouting little white hairs.
No. Layers. Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers. You get it. We both have layers.
Speaking of ogres and layers, the Etruscans, a pre-Indo-European people group who lived in what is now northern and central Italy around the same time that Rome was nothing more than a small village, believed that reality was composed of several layers. One of these layers was the underworld, ruled by the god Orcus. Orcus was associated with various evil spirits, both in the underworld and later the actual world, if you could call it that. These creatures were oftentimes called Orco by Proto-Italian peasants. As Etruscan and later Roman influence seeped into what is now France, the word Orco would morph into the French word ogre. The earliest record of the word ogre being used in written texts that we know of was in the fairy tales of Charles Perrault, who also wrote Cinderella, Puss in Boots, and Little Red Riding Hood during the 1600s in France. Perrault, the father of fairy tales, if you could call him that, didn't create these stories out of thin air. They are passed on from generation to generation, bard from camp to bard to other camp, parent to child, with details of each story changing each time they were told. Perrault put these words to pen, with his own spin, and as a result, his stories have now become the most canon versions, if you could call it that. After all, we don't have any voice recordings from 2200 years ago to find out what specific details there were about ogres from the ancient Etruscans. Perrault would later inspire the Brothers Grimm in what is now Germany during the 1800s. They compiled a revamped set of folktales and fairy tales such as The Princess and the Frog, more formally known as The Frog Prince, alongside Rumpelstiltskin, Hansel and Gretel, Sleeping Beauty, and the aforementioned Little Red Riding Hood. Another prominent author was the Dane Hans Christian Andersen, most well known for The Little Mermaid. Granted, these stories were far from the sanitized stories you were told as children. Many of them include graphic violence, oftentimes a way to instill fear in children in order to ensure obedience. For example, unlike the Disney version of The Little Mermaid, the original doesn't involve her marrying the prince. It ends with her being abandoned, mutilated as a globster washed up on the beach for crabs to eat. To be fair, her soul does rise up into heaven though. In 20th century America, Walt Disney and his studio would adapt many of these stories to film, starting out with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which became a huge hit. These Disney adaptations were cinematic masterpieces, but in order to adapt to 20th century modern sensibilities and markets, they had to tone down the graphic violence. After all, the Grimm's Brother tales were less Disney and more like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Other stories like Sleeping Beauty involve Bill Cosby-like behavior, and the prince in Rapunzel falls out of the tower turning into protein paste. Thankfully for the mental health of children during the 1930s and 40s and several generations afterwards, none of them were acquainted with the real story of Cinderella, which involved her stepsisters cutting off her toes and heels to fit into a glass shoe, or how Cinderella gets revenge on her stepsisters by getting her pet bird friends to peck their eyes out. After Walt Disney died in 1966, the company would dip in revenue and quality during the 70s and 80s. The Disney malaise did not last forever, thankfully. This changed for the better during the late 80s. The CEO, Michael Eisner, and the executive, Jeffrey Katzenberg, would form a dynamic duo, leading to what is now called the Disney Renaissance during the early 80s and throughout the 90s, with movies like The Little Mermaid, as I mentioned before, based off of the aforementioned Hans Christian Andersen tale. These movies appealed to millennial girls who were children at the time. Disney had a solid formula at this point. Some wide-eyed female protagonists from any race or background, a love interest, and an animal sidekick. The Little Mermaid would solidify this formula. Also, the movie had a priest with an erection. Make that what you will, but at least it's better than kids getting disemboweled. At this point, American animators wanted to appeal to a global audience outside of North America and Europe, and as a result, they took many folktales from other cultural canons, such as Arabian Night stories and Chinese folklore. However, Eisner and Katzenberg had a falling out and a personal dispute after the Disney president, Frank Wells, passed away. Katzenberg wanted the position of president, but Eisner not only refused his request, but also fired him. Katzenberg would then team up with Steven Spielberg, who needs no introduction, to launch DreamWorks. DreamWorks' first movie was the 1998 Ants, with a Z or Z at the end. The same year, Disney released A Bug's Life. Both movies involved anthropomorphic insects based off of the ancient Greeks' Aesop's tale of the ant and the grasshopper. Despite the rivalry, both were a commercial and artistic success. Despite being based off of the same story by Aesop, they were actually executed very differently, with A Bug's Life being your typical Disney happy-go-lucky story, while Ants being more rough around the edges and a little bit more irreverent, and this gets very relevant later on. DreamWorks would follow this with the critically acclaimed movie The Prince of Egypt, based off the book of Exodus, and it was arguably the best cinematic adaptation of the book of Exodus since the Ten Commandments of the 1950s. This would be followed by other movies such as The Road to El Dorado, which covers the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs and the search for the fabled city of El Dorado. Then came Chicken Run, which involved 3D clay animation, as well as the direct-to-video movie titled Joseph, the King of Dreams, a prequel to The Prince of Egypt, based around the biblical character Joseph, who was one of the 12 sons of Jacob before the Tales of Moses. By the way, not to sound too 2010s PC-ish, but why does the Middle Eastern Joseph look like a 2020s white looks-maxing guy? Anyway. In 2001, a movie would be released which would dwarf all of the other DreamWorks projects, Shrek. The idea was to combine various fairy tales from The Gingerbread Man to Pinocchio to The Three Little Pigs and countless other tales in nearly every Western person's mind into some familiar yet different story, set in a medieval fantasy setting in which all of these diverse characters just live together. After all, most of these stories and their characters are centuries, if not millennia old. The screenwriter's choice to combine all of these famous characters into one made the new fictional universe of Shrek very familiar. The movies opened up with a fairy tale book with pages turning with your cliché story of a princess who needs to be rescued from a dragon by some Prince Charming type figure. And then there's an outhouse. Yes, the whimsical tale in which we are introduced to the titular character is a guy taking a shit. See, unlike Disney movies, which are set in a squeaky clean, sanitized version of the oftentimes brutal fantasy tales of the past, Shrek would flip the heads of both of these settings, both the Brothers Grimm and Walt Disney. Instead, DreamWorks created a world of comedic irreverence. As stated before, the epic stories of the past were replaced with a movie that starts off with a fat green guy who just took a dump voiced by Mike Myers with a Scottish accent. And instead of opening up to the original composed music of Tim Rice and Elton John that was meant to be inherently beautiful and inspiring, Shrek opens up to the tune of Smash Mouth's hit song All Star. Shrek would combine the iconic characters and settings of all of this folklore, but put a modern spin on all of them. The supposed Prince Charming protagonist is instead replaced with a neckbeard living in a swamp. The princess is not so much a damsel in distress, but rather a master of martial arts. Yeah, the Princess Fiona can beat up several grown men, a trope that was really funny during the 2000s before it became overplayed and turned into pop feminist cringe during the 2010s. And then there is also the talking donkey character called Donkey, yes, very original, voiced by Eddie Murphy, who acts as comic relief in a plot that is almost always composed of comic relief. Oh, and I forgot to mention that the villain of the original movie, Lord Farquaad, is believed to be based off of the former Disney CEO, Michael Eisner. Clip. Shrek would prove to be a massive hit, grossing nearly $500 million back in 2001, and was loved by critics and the general public alike. Like most Pixar movies, this movie managed to appeal to both children and parents even though it wasn't a Pixar movie. The movie also won the Oscar for Best Animated Feature for 2001, the first year when the category was implemented. The story of the first movie ends not with an ugly ogre turning into a Prince Charming, but rather the beautiful princess turning into an ugly ogre, and them living happily ever after. Until the second movie came out, further flipping common fantasy tropes on their heads. The success of the first movie prompted Shrek 2, which was also critically acclaimed and arguably the best out of the franchise. Who can say no to an Antonio Banderas playing the role of a hyper-masculine romantic Chad Spaniard in the body of a cat? Puss in Boots. In this movie, Shrek must face off against the real Prince Charming, who proves to be a massive douche, along with his mother, the fairy grandmother, who is kind of like every overused mother-in-law joke wrapped up into a character. This was followed by Shrek III, oftentimes regarded as the worst of the franchise, in which Shrek and his wife Fiona don't really want to rule the land of far, far away, but instead have to find King Arthur to take up the role. King Arthur, in this version of the tale, is represented as a high school loser bullied by jocks. The franchise's ability to take fantasy and put it into a medieval setting and then mix and match that with modern world settings such as a high school drama added into the incongruency needed for comedy. After all, the logic behind comedy is that comedy involves two or more entities that lack logical consistency. This is why supposedly family-friendly characters talking about low-key sexual references is rather funny. Look, it's a thong. This was followed by Shrek Forever After. Focus on forever after. See, it's a pun, even though it's lame, but it still works. This introduces us to other ogres outside of Shrek and Fiona. In this movie, the couple are parents. Usually fictional tales about couples end when the couple gets back together or gets married, but rarely continues after having children, as family life is usually considered to be too boring for either a romantic plot or an adventure plot. Stability is great for raising kids, but it sucks for romance, novelty, bedroom fun, and adventure. The movie did alright. The movie wasn't as successful as the first two, but I did like how it managed to create a story after the characters supposedly lived happily ever after. Stories always involve conflicts and or problems. Man versus nature, man versus God, man versus society, man versus himself. But the idea of creating a story after the happy ending is really an uphill battle. But in a way, having a plot after living happily ever after does make sense, since the life of a relatively happy, stable family doesn't mean that life isn't without conflicts and hardships. There's a reason why most comedy shows and sitcoms at the end of the day are centered around families, usually dealing with relatively small issues and conundrums episode by episode rather than being part of some epic cataclysmic event. It turned out though that Forever After wasn't the Forever After, as Shrek 5 will come out in 2027. Speaking of other movies, Puss in Boots would also get his own spin-off movies, and Donkey will get his own spin-off movie in 2028. Long-form movies were not the only art form. Short films were also made alongside a Christmas television special, a web series, countless video games, a Broadway musical, toys for kids, toys for neckbeards, a themed zone in Universal Studios Singapore based off of the setting of Far, Far Away, and even Shrek foods such as Shrek ketchup and Shrek TV dinners. Eating those Shrek TV dinners would probably result in your toilet bowl turning into the sludge swamp Shrek bathes in. Is all of this a testament to the incredible creative expression of Shrek? Or a shitty corporate cash grab to make billions off of merchandise slop? The answer to that question is yes and yes. Any commie bastard watching this can complain all you want, but the Soviet Union collapsed over 30 years ago, while Shrek is alive and kicking, selling chicken nuggets shaped like his head. Another victory for capitalism. One aspect of Shrek's legacy, which wasn't corporatized, was his influence on meme culture. Shrek is possibly the most memeable pop culture creation, only rivaled by SpongeBob. Both franchises involve humorous characters whose emotional expression has been exaggerated by the cartoonists exceptionally well. This led to countless Shrek memes being used in numerous settings to mock everything from everyday circumstances to political debates. Internet memes, unlike say television shows, movies, or even Twinkies, which look like they've been filled with Shrek's diarrhea after consuming too much Shrek ketchup, are not subject to copyright protection. They operate as the Wild West of culture without intellectual property rights and are not something you can typically monetize unless you're someone who just posts Shrek memes on X.com. And if you do, man, it's really time to get a job and some hobbies. The memes have prolonged the cultural influence of the franchise, even after there have been several years in between major movies, TV shows, and video games. 20 years after the first film was released, the US Library of Congress picked Shrek to be one of the pieces of American culture to be preserved by the US government. This status is preserved by the Library of Congress for works of art which are, quote, culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Keep in mind that throughout much of human history, a lot of our cultural heritage has been lost and forgotten. Much of the knowledge of the Baghdad House of Wisdom during the Islamic Golden Age was lost when the Mongols burned it down. If you go back earlier, the ancient Phoenicians were an ancient Iron Age people group native to what is now Lebanon, who produced one of the most advanced maritime cultures before modernity. However, almost everything we know about the Phoenicians comes from other cultures such as the Greeks and later the Romans, as the Phoenicians wrote their stories on papyrus, which unlike say Egyptian stone or the cuneiform from say the ancient Sumerians, does not survive the test of time. In a previous video, I mentioned the Lindy effect, which states that non-perishable entities like stories and characters age in reverse. A story like Jack and the Beanstalk, which by the way is referenced in the Shrek movies, is not a modern or even a medieval tale. It has proto-versions dating back to over 5,000 years ago to the Proto-Indo-Europeans. This story has stood the test of time and probably will continue to stand the test of time. According to statistician Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the staying power of these stories is a testament to the likelihood that they will continue to be told long into the future. This is in sharp contrast to the fads and most memes which we're familiar with, which have short lifespans of popularity. Shrek and his memes continue to survive and thrive, not as fads, but as icons forever after. Given Shrek's continued popularity a quarter of a century later, and the fact that it is now Uncle Sam's duty to make sure that this epic tale of a green guy who shits in an outhouse survives, perhaps the tale of Shrek will become as timeless as many of the secondary characters he shares his universe with.